and at the same time, it's being live streamed for our audiences and subscribers on YouTube. There will be a question and answer session at the end of Professor Cvetkovich's talk, and all of you are requested to kindly post your questions in the chat box, which will be then addressed to Professor Anne Cvetkovich. This lecture series is being organized under the guidance of our head of the department, Professor Simi Malhotra. I request you to kindly deliver the welcome address and introduce Professor Anne Cvetkovich.
Thank you so much, Suman. Professor Anne Cvetkovich, our invited speaker this evening, and all others who've joined us from all parts of the world. I, on behalf of the Department of English at Jamia Millia Islamia, extend a very warm welcome to all of you to this distinguished lecture series. Friends, as Suman said, this is the 30th lecture of our series, and we're indeed very, very fortunate to have with us Professor Anne Cvetkovich, one of the most important voices and urgent voices of our times, as our distinguished speaker this evening. It is such an honor and privilege for us to host Professor Cvetkovich, and we are all waiting to hear her speak on grappling with care. I'm extremely grateful to you, Professor Cvetkovich, for agreeing to share your time and your scholarship with us this evening. Thank you so much. I welcome you. And now it is my honor and privilege to introduce Professor Anne Cvetkovich formally to all of you. Professor Cvetkovich is currently professor in the Feminist Institute of Social Transformation at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. She's been Ellen Clayton Garwood Centennial Professor of English and Professor of Women's and Gender Studies, and founder director of LGBTQ Studies at the Universities of Texas at Austin. Professor Cvetkovich is the author of Mixed Feelings, Feminism, Mass Culture, and Victorian Sensationalism, 1992, An Archive of Feelings, Trauma, Sexuality, and Lesbian Public Cultures, 2003, and Depression, A Public Feeling, 2012. She's co-edited Public Sentiments, a special issue of the journal The Scholar and Feminist Online, and the book Political Emotions, 2010. She's also been co-editor of GLQ, a journal of lesbian and gay studies. Her current writing projects focus on the current state of LGBTQ archives and the creative use of them by artists to create counter archives and interventions in public history. Professor Cvetkovich's scholarship is wide-ranging. While some of her early work is historical, dealing with Victorian literature and mass culture, most of her recent work engages with contemporary cultural texts and political issues. All of her work is shaped by her interest in feeling as both a subject of exploration and framework for analysis. Professor Cvetkovich's work is associated with the Public Feelings Project, which is interested in the relationship between the public and political and the private and affective. It emphasizes the significance of everyday life and affective experience. One of the cells of the project is Feel Tank Chicago, which came up with the idea of political depression, a concept Professor Cvetkovich works with substantially in her book, Depression, A Public Feeling. Professor Cvetkovich in her work engages with feminist and queer theory, affect and feeling, theories of the archive, and oral history. Her interdisciplinary works explores a wide range of cultural and artistic forms, including documentary film, memoirs, music and dance performances, literature, and visual art. We are so honored, Professor Cvetkovich, to have you with us. We can't thank you enough. Over to you, Professor Cvetkovich. We're so looking forward to this talk.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Malhotra. I am really excited to be here, even if only by Zoom. It's something that we have been able to experience, I think, as a COVID silver lining, a concept I have some ambivalence about and have written about, but it is true that there are certain ways in which social media and Zoom have allowed us to connect across great distances of time and culture. And that was a fantastic introduction, actually, because one of the questions I've had for you in our exchange as we've been trying to schedule this lecture for some time was for me to think, well, what do you know of me and what can I offer to you in your context? So it's really helpful to hear you lay out those things and to think of ways in which the work that I and my colleagues have been doing under the rubric of affect studies and its intersections with gender and sexuality studies might indeed be useful there. I can see that to be the case, particularly as someone who does, as you mentioned, have a background in 19th century and Victorian literature. So, the history of the British Empire has long been important to my understanding also of histories of capitalism, which are a significant frame for my work. I've included what has become customary in North America, which is the land acknowledgement that says that I'm here on Algonquin territory, otherwise known as Ottawa, the capital city of Canada. And it's interesting always for me outside of North America to think about what land acknowledgement would mean. I know that there are, so many cultures and histories that have walked each piece of land in the South Asian region. I think also then of the histories of colonization and decolonization that continue to produce conflict and violence in India. So I hope that I can bridge between our locations, but rootedness in body and land is central to the work that I'm trying to do. And so what that looks like is very context specific. So I'll be speaking to you from my context and hoping to learn something about your context. The first section of the talk, I think I'll be about, I want to leave time for questions. I can go a bit longer than the hour if need be. I'll try to be about 30 to 40 minutes, just prompt me at the 30-minute mark and we'll just clip if we want to go to questions at that point, if there's enough on the table. I'll tell you a bit further about in a moment about this concept of grappling, but I don't have a PowerPoint, but I'm going to hold up books. So first I want to acknowledge Eli Clare, and hopefully there'll be some scribes who can put some of these names in the chat, who's a wonderful scholar of queer and disability studies and activist. And this book, Brilliant Imperfection, has as its subtitle, Grappling with Cure. And so I've taken this notion of grappling, which I'll explain as a methodological principle as part of my talk, but the grappling with a number of concepts. Cure is one, care is another, trauma is another, disability and madness also come up. But the first one I begin with is grappling with the mental health crisis. And I put that in quotation marks, actually, because I have some ambivalence about even using that term to describe a phenomenon that is multifaceted. And I think goes beyond the medical frame that is implicit in this idea of mental health. So over the last decade, at the very least, and this is work that does very much follow up on the unfinished work of the Depression, A Public Feeling book, I've watched discourses of mental health and madness circulate in new ways, not only in academic scholarship, but in the public sphere. I've been watching two arenas with particular interest, the university and activisms. Within the university, what feels like, and this again would be a very interesting point of comparison as to what's going on in your institutions. Much of what I'm saying would be very familiar to anyone in a US or Canadian context, but where we have what I'm calling neoliberal emotional management, and I borrow that term emotional management in part from the use also of diversity in the US Academy, sort of diversity management, like how to deal with racialized differences and some of the strategies for that. This emotional management is producing another term, which is called trauma-centered care, for dealing with increasing, indeed epidemic levels of everyday anxiety and depression for students, not to mention faculty and staff who often are left out of that picture because of the urgency of the problems for students. And this anxiety and depression, I think Dr. Malhotra has already anticipated what I'm going to say here about the link between the putatively medical and the political, or feelings and social structures. In the US and Canada, we've had increasing levels of violence ranging from active shooters and guns on campus. The stats on mass shootings in the US just this year alone, and also in Canada, are just astounding. As well as the impact of a larger political context that includes crazy people in the White House. I started writing this when Trump was in power, but of course we still have many I'll just call them crazy politicians everywhere, including in your country, and Black death on the streets, which has been a central issue in the US in the last 10 years. It's not a new phenomenon, but it's come to increasing attention through the Black Lives Matter movement. Border wars are huge in the US, particularly along the US-Mexico border, the problem of refugees, also people coming from Syria, from Afghanistan, from a range of areas across the globe. Bathroom bills, you may or may not be familiar with this, but gender skirmishes around a kind of targeting of transgender and gender non-normative people as part of a gender and sexual panic, I think, that is part of the routing of, you know, the problem is the gays, or the problem is people shifting genders. And oh yes, and then a pandemic. So I, again, started writing this list before the pandemic, and then you add that in, and it's quite a potent mix. Obviously, the list in your context might be different, but I think we would be speaking across shared phenomena. So the specificity of where I began was the University of Texas campus, where I was a faculty member until 2019, where in 2015, the crazy state government passed campus carry legislation, which made it legal to carry concealed weapons on our campus. We fought this long and hard, but lost really that battle. In fact, while guns were legal, the signs of our group called Gun Free UT were illegal. Like, the administration was like, you cannot have signs saying Gun Free UT on your windows. We had 2 students murdered in 2 successive years. One case in open view of many students on a plaza outside the gym. It was just before the end of the spring semester, and required all kinds of immediate care and concern. Those of us teaching grew used to having to negotiate trauma in the classroom. The name of one of the helpful handouts we received from the university administration, along with lots of concerned email announcements from the president, the provost, the dean of students, and the campus mental health services. And this phenomenon of communication, especially in a digital age, has become very interesting to observe, at least in our universities. Again, it's become very central part of the pandemic and what kind of communication one gets about what one's experiencing. There's a full-time institutional apparatus at work. In fact, it's created a lot of jobs in administration that often seem to take resource away from funding for, say, let's say, more faculty or financial aid for students. And the problems only seem to worsen. Moreover, my move to Canada in 2019, which is famous for being less violent than the US, increasingly that is no longer the case. So we're also dealing in Canada with the chronic mental health crisis here. And I just want to note a universal healthcare system that is strained to the point of breaking. So we hear a lot about the problems with healthcare in the US, but Canada has its own set of problems, even with government-funded healthcare. These discussions, of course, have only accelerated in this time of pandemic, when all of us, I'm sure you would have stories to tell, are having to think about our own mental health and that of many others on a daily basis. Of course, it's students, but then it's family members, other networks, and so on. At our university, this is again true in the US, there is a lot of attention to this. So for example, we have a new mental health and wellness strategic plan at Carleton University, which has of course taken many meetings and much work to develop. But often the outcome is what I call a vernacular, what's known in the vernacular as self-care that falls to the individual. Take a walk, take a break, take a breath. There's a strong critique of this as a neoliberal policy where responsibility still lies with the individual students, teachers, and employees to get help, which often takes the form of medicalized care. So it's like seek professional health, seek a therapist. And of course, there's not nearly enough resource to go around. And I take it that this also, just looking at the WHO policies and websites about India last night, the idea is like, oh, India just needs like more therapists. But that actually has not proven, I think, to be a solution in North America, even with greater resource allocated in that direction. So I wonder if that's really the direction to go in terms of public health in other places. What I would advocate for, and again, Dr. Malhotra has anticipated this in her introduction, would be attention to systemic and structural change. In the workplace, in the classroom, as we grapple with economic and social crisis, which is of course only growing more extreme with each year, and all of this again, I think, was true before the pandemic. The pandemic has not changed this; it's just sort of exposed it more fully. Although I will say that I am a big advocate of or fan of the kind of slogan from Arundhati Roy that has circulated globally, which is to see the pandemic as a portal to something else. But of course, she wrote that at the beginning of the pandemic, and 2+ years later, whether that portal is open in a productive way is still, I think, quite an open question. But I do maintain hope, and this work is motivated by that hope for moving to a different way. I'm also struck then, and this is one of my sources of hope actually, is the attention to mental health that has grown more prominent in activist circles, including do-it-yourself anarchisms, feminist and queer of color activisms, trans and disability justice activisms, where understandings of self-care circulate alongside concepts of radical care, collective care. Mutual aid also has become has had a surge in attention coming out of anarchist traditions from the early part of the 20th century. And these other terms alongside of self-care, like radical care, collective care, are of course designed to try to address the individualism that often attaches to notions of self-care and often also treatment of mental health. As someone who's been part of conversations about political depression within activist circles that can be a result of burnout and collective failure and disappointment, I've been very intrigued by this work because it speaks to the need to think about the emotional dynamics of activism. And I'd be very interested to see if there's any of this kind of discourse in India. I will note I've always been interested because of my interest in comparative trauma histories, in scholarship on the history of partition, and also sort of the failures of the nation building and decolonial process in India, and the way in which that also is a site of political depression, not only in the immediate wake of decolonization in the late 40s, but also in an ongoing way as there are uprisings of various kinds or suppressed forms of revolution and so on. I think political depression, to me, clearly seems to be a category that would be of multi-generational relevance to the situation in India and South Asia more generally. So in the US, Black Lives Matter has been a key location for this new form of activism that I welcome with open arms. I see it as the result of, again, a multi-generational lineage, and it does have to do with the central presence of the feminist and queer work. One of the key, and this is where actually questions of the literary and writing come in. One of the key icons for this has been Audre Lorde. I would also mention James Baldwin, as well as Octavia Butler. Lorde's words, this is from her set of essays called A Burst of Light, as well as, much of her other work as well. Anything by her is, canonical text in this context, but this line from Burst of Light: taking care of myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. That is has been taken up in activist contexts in a way that's been very interesting to watch. What is this distinction between self-indulgence and self-preservation? Emerging from the specific context, not only of Black feminism, but her struggle with cancer, I think that's important. Lorde's phrase, taking care of myself, has also morphed into the concept of self-care as it has gained in popularity. Its prominence in both activist and self-help circles has led to much grappling. So this is where grappling comes back, right? That there's a tension there of which kind of self-care do we mean? Is this the good form or the bad form? There's a fear that it's also very individualist, as in the notion of self-care, and that it pulls focus from real political activity or structural change. And again, I'm thinking of India, a place that has a much stronger, more prominent Marxist political tradition than is the case in the US anymore at this point. But anyone who's been involved in those leftist conversations, particularly ones that are dominated by men, I'll just say, there's always that I mean, I've been in those rooms, right, where it's like, what is the real struggle? And attention to feelings is seen as very femmy or wussy, or we don't have time for that. We have to move forward with a strategy of some kind. So again, this is why I really take note at the amazing work that a new generation of BIPOC, which is our shorthand for Black, Indigenous, people of color activisms, queer and disabled activists. And particularly, I'm not going to have time to talk about all of them in detail, but if we were to have some bibliography in the chat, again, I'll hold up the books. This is Leah Lakshmi Peepsa Samarasinha, which actually has Sri Lankan descent. Her book, Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice, is one. Also, Adrienne Marie Brown, who's the author and now publisher of many books, including this one, Emergent Strategy, very influenced not only by Audre Lorde, but by Octavia Butler, in the mode of a kind of Afrofuturism. And then also many books by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. This is her book, Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals. And interestingly enough, a lot of these books are published by smaller activist presses. So for me, it's also very reminiscent of the small publishing that was very vibrant in the 70s and 80s for feminist and queer work, for example. So there's a kind of return to that grassroots publishing network that I think is very important in terms of the status of a literary in a print public sphere. It's also amplified by social media and digital forms of communication that extend the networks that are being created by these books. One place you could look, even since someone is putting names in the chat, would be the list for AK Press in the US, which is a small collective activist press, and Adrienne Marie Brown has a book series now through that press. Here's one of their recent books called Holding Change, which is subtitled The Way of Emergent Strategy, Facilitation, and Mediation. And many of the folks who are part of this network of activist activists are being published. So this has just been swelling really in the context of Black Lives Matter and the pandemic. So I'm really interested in this new generation of work, but I'm also interested in the way that new generation of work is very mindful of its ancestral lineages. So Alexis Pauline Gumbs, for example, is currently at work on a eagerly anticipated biography of Audre Lorde, and it will be really interesting to see. There have been other biographies of Audre Lorde already, but I think hers will be very creative, very poetic, because she's also a poet, and do the work also then of making Audre Lorde's work available for new generations. So I've been wanting to track their work in what's a short book that I seem to be writing in my sabbatical year. And so I want to see how that multi-generational lineage of Black feminisms provides resources for understanding self-care in ways that are not distinct from collective care, and also make it possible to reframe mental health as both what it is and how to achieve it as a form of freedom. So I want to focus on that. Freedom and decolonization of the body-mind. So this also would be, again, a place of really interesting comparative crossroads between North America and India. That is, what is the unfinished business of decolonization? There has been work on the decolonization of the mind through Frantz Fanon, in a way that is inflected by psychoanalysis, like what are the wounds that are carried, where political emancipation is not enough. There has to be kind of social emancipation. And now I think we're considering decolonization as not just about the mind, but about the body as well. So what does it mean to feel free in the body? Of course, activists around gender and sexuality have long been thinking about this. And then I use the term body mind, which has become very common within disability studies, where we no longer think of body and mind as separate in some Cartesian dualism, but instead as integrated in ways that also have implications for a practice around decolonization or sovereignty. So, okay, I'm reading kind of slowly, which is fine. I just, in a way, I wanted to just introduce the project to you. I just have a little bit, and then I'll talk about Eli Clare, and then maybe say a little bit about either Adrienne Marie Brown or Peepsna Samra Sinha. But I did want to just say a little bit about this notion of like why I'm a bit skeptical about mental health crisis, but also grappling with it. So I have this little section called mental health crisis in the headlines. I just started working on it a couple of weeks ago. So this talk's also been great because I've been like squirreled away in my writing room, and there's new stuff that I get to kind of share with you. But I do feel like mental health crisis has become this like shorthand headline. So if you Google mental health crisis, tons of hits come up. So just in the New York Times alone, there's something almost every day. Because I'm interested in students in the academy, I'm also been interested in youth and adolescents. So for example, in the New York Times, under the heading mental health and disorders that you can use as a search term, sample headlines include "It's Life or Death, the Mental Health Crisis Among U.S. Teens," "Inside the Adolescent Mental Health Crisis," "Meeting the Mental Health Challenge at School and at Home." In the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is the key journal for what's going on in the academy, also tons of hits. If you put in mental health crisis, also scholarly journals. I checked Google Scholar, and again, this is well predates the pandemic, that there's been much ink spilled over this problem in journals of higher ed administration in the US. I'm not really a stats person, but it is pretty astonishing, really, if you see the numbers of prescription drugs, like the rise in pharmaceutical prescriptions for anxiety and depression. Again, this is a global phenomenon. I don't know India's stats in particular, but again, it's a cheap way, right, of being able to treat people, but it often then just fits into a medical paradigm. I did also Google mental health crisis in India to see what came up. And again, lots of stories. So I gather this is also a headline in your part of the world as well. So I would be prepared, as we have done with the pandemic, right, to call this a public health emergency by any measure. But I still want to keep pushing against the medical paradigm that is implicit in that category. If it's a crisis, it's what my public feelings colleague, Lauren Berlant, would call a form of crisis ordinary, right? A problem that is long in the making and chronic, not a sudden or unexpected phenomenon. But, you know, again, this is all work that has already been done in Lauren's work, in my work before, but I still am kind of hanging on to that headline because it, and also my experiences in the classroom, because it tells me there's still something there, right? So what is it that I can do? What is to be done as I, you know, try to help my students, as I try to help younger family members? I don't myself have children, but you know, any of my friends who have young adult children are often struggling with really serious concerns for young people at this time. So I've just felt compelled to tackle this problem again and see where we are now. So in the book I'm writing, I'm proposing to offer some humble tools. This might be where English literature and, you know, cultural theory comes in, from the world of cultural theory that I inhabit, but also from lived experience. I've been wanting to bring that in more in academia, with my own experiences of depression and anxiety, my belonging in lesbian feminist circles that have really fed me, my participation in activism. Also, another thing that's kind of come into the fore is my own somatic practices. So the things I do with my body, like swimming, yoga is very important. So that would be another link to the question of like, what is the status of yoga as a transnational phenomenon? I'm always wanting to talk to people in India about that. And so this is where we come to what I wanted to say about grappling, going back to Eli Clare. I found this tool of Eli Clare's so useful, because it's opened up places that have been stuck for me, you know, because I just keep being like, no medical, you know, but on the other hand, it's there. So so Clare has provided, I think grappling is a more vernacular term for what in the cultural theory parlance, those of you might be familiar with debates around critique and the reparative, particularly coming out of Eve Sedgwick's work, that have been foundational for affect studies. I'm just trying to find new ways, right, of using critique, but also trying to construct something different. So interestingly enough, Clare's notion of grappling comes with the question of cure for those with disabilities. He's an ardent advocate for not seeking cure. He's also embedded in community with those who do. And the act of grappling constitutes a very ethical and respectful acknowledgement of different ways of thinking about cure. This is a quotation from Eli Clare. He says, as an ideology seeped into every corner of white Western thought and culture. So again, we could pause over that in the South Asian context. Cure rides on the back of normal and natural. Insidious and pervasive, it impacts most of us. In response, we need neither a wholehearted acceptance nor an outright rejection of cure, but rather a broad-based grappling. Claire introduces this idea of grappling after having described ranting, another interesting affectively loaded term. Ranting would be the desire to wipe out stupid notions of cure that depend on medical models, that turn disability into a problem or abnormality. At the heart of his approach is a queer sensibility whose embrace of the non-normative I recognize very well. And I also recognize critique as rant. I'm sure we all have, found ourselves in those moments, especially when it feels like your voice is not heard. So I think it's particularly can be a problem of oppression. And so the ranting comes up in many circles I've been associated with, including pro-sex feminisms and radical feminisms. When in conversation with or even confronted by a friend or someone he actually knows, Claire's vehemence drops away. He says, my impulse to rant has vanished. And I think these are some of the affective dynamics of sociability, also what others in my circle have called the antisocial in queer theory. And I think it especially relates to infighting. So this takes us back to the question of the affect of politics, sectarianism, and so on, that again is rampant in many different contexts. And so Claire says, I let this multitude of relationships we have to disability, illness, suffering, injustice, and cure jostle me, knowing that I need this exact tangle of conflicting and overlapping conversations. Holding it all, sickness and human vulnerability, health and disability, the need for and the rejection of cure is much harder work than writing anti-cure diatribes, and much more necessary. There's humility, I find, in Claire's engagement with ideas as embodied in people's lives. Like Eve Sedgwick arguing for the flexibility of weak theory, Claire is able to hold out for messiness rather than clarity, for jostling and tangling rather than the self-righteous conviction of the rant. I think this is just so important at this moment where many of us do feel like ranting. I mean, we have plenty of reason to rant morning, noon, and night with the stupidity that we are and the just craven corruption that we are confronted with in so many of our putatively democratic governments. But I think we have to move in some different directions. So grappling for me suggests both physical and psychic movement, perhaps twisted and uncomfortable, but still a form of engagement or emotion, rather than the fixity or rigidity of impasse or distress. So how can we become, more flexible? And again, there's a body-mind dimension here that's really important to me, and interesting to think about flexibility and movement in the context of disability, right? So to think about those categories in non-normative terms where flexibility could take many forms, right? It doesn't just have to be the privilege of the able body. In addition to being a powerful model for the intersections of queer and trans and disability studies, Claire's work has encouraged me to continue to grapple with mental health in the medical sense, with clinical diagnosis and pharmaceutical treatment, and with pragmatic approaches to intervention, particularly in institutional settings where it can be valuable to put infrastructure in place. I keep listening to those for whom medical care has been important and who push back against my work when it seems to question the choice to take medications or to seek psychiatric help. This has been a real issue for me in the academy, where I want my students to have a counseling center they can go to for assistance, or I want there to be some kind of place to go. And another big issue for us in the US, I don't know about the accommodation apparatus in India, but increasingly, we do have more attention to accommodations for students, like more time on tests for students who are neurodiverse, for students who have cognitive disabilities. But now students who are diagnosed with anxiety and depression are increasingly able to ask for accommodations, but that apparatus has a lot of weaknesses to it. It's often not functional. It takes so much work often for students to get accommodations. And if you're not feeling well, it's very hard to navigate those systems. So it's still a bit of a mess, what that should look like. And it's also just the numbers are skyrocketing, like the numbers of students who are seeking accommodation. Another place where I grapple, I wanted to mention this example because, again, as I think about this in a transnational context, one of the responses to my work that has been the most kind of compelling and moving to me over this last decade was a piece that was written by the Egyptian journalist Nara Antoun, and those of you with my text might be able to find the link. It was in an online publication called Madamasar in 2017. And Antoun was very interested in the concept of political depression. Again, I'm very interested in how can this concept travel, like how it was developed in a US context, but here it was being used in Egypt after the revolution, and particularly in the context of suppression of the revolution and massacres of people that took place. And so Antoun considers the relevance of political depression to activists involved in the Egyptian revolution as it devolves into a series of failures and disappointments, including the ongoing suppression of protests, such as the massacre of over 1,000 people in August 2013. While sympathetic to political understanding of depression, Antoun finds herself troubled by the needs of her fellow activists who are struggling with ways to get help when mourning the dead and in the absence of political transformation, and often turn to clinical forms of care, which again makes sense to me. You know, if someone is suicidal, if someone is unable to get out of bed and the revolution is nowhere in sight, you know, what to do. So I think we have to continue to grapple or continue to have a mixed modality where there's some place for the medical, but where it can be complemented by both a critique of the medical and understanding of structural change. So I think I actually need to stop there, but I'll just say that's like a little taste from the intro to the book, and where it's landing is in this grappling with different concepts. So care is definitely one of them, going back to Audre Lorde, but also seeing what these younger folks that I mentioned to you are dealing with. I'd be interested again in what's going on in the Indian and South Asian context. Care, I write about what I call the care explosion. It's like that keyword is everywhere now in activist and institutional context. Here's Hill Malatino's book, Trans Care. Here's Ivan Coyote, who's a trans writer, a book of letters called Care Of that came through in the pandemic, a book called The Care We Dream Of, Liberatory and Transformative Approaches to LGBTQ plus Health, written by a Canadian activist. Dean Spade's book on mutual aid, also published by a small press. In a more academic context, this book called Matters of Care, written by the scholar Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, who was a student of Donna Haraway's, whose work is really important here. So just an amazing, expansion of resources. So care is one of my topics. Also, disability and madness. So what happens if mental health is viewed more in terms of critical disability, which embraces the non-normative and the neurodiverse, and mad activisms, anti-psychiatric mad activisms are on the upswing here in North America, and that's an interesting phenomenon. Then I have another section on trauma, going back to the category of trauma, which I have critiqued, but kind of looking at really interesting folks who are working with the category of trauma, particularly in the context of racial justice. So really thinking about trauma as historical and political. So in the context of North America, it would be the what Saidiya Hartman has called, say, the afterlife of slavery, the afterlife of indigenous genocide, the afterlife of migration politics. That these are all the things we have to grapple with still. And again, that's why I think partition is so important to me, is that unfinished business as it continues to haunt both Pakistan and India, and, you know, is responsible for sectarian conflict that is daily and ongoing. There's so much to learn there. I always learn from anything that I get to hear about that context. But I'm calling that chapter on trauma the somatic turn, because a lot of the most interesting, to my mind, work in trauma also moves towards a somatic approach and these very interesting alternative practices of healing the body that move in the direction of a political understanding of liberation or freedom. And then my final section is going to be about breath. Breath has also become an interesting keyword in Black feminisms. Ashen Crawley has written on Pentecostal breath in a religious context. And I'll just say, this is another strange synchronicity. I am a yoga practitioner who also works in the Kundalini tradition as it was brought by Yogi Bhajan to the US. So it's a Kundalini and Sikh related tradition. So it's kind of interesting to me that, and I'm grappling also with questions of appropriation and dissemination, but I am finding myself writing about, you know, very specific concepts from Kundalini because I have learned so much from them, including different mantras, the kind of Bij mantra, seed mantra in the Kundalini tradition is Satnam. And so, you know, I have just like been in a form of study, and I talk about study as a resource. And again, it's very personal, but it has been quite important to me. So that might be another point of intersection or conversation we could have. So I'll pause there.
Right. And such an important talk for us. And I remember when I approached you, you know, one has, of course, read your work, and especially your work on political depression. And, you know, when you were talking about that, what is the state of mental health in India, and just hearing you speak about the directions in which your work itself is advanced makes us realize that we haven't even made the first steps probably in our academic, you know, discourses addressing many of these issues. I'll share the work that, you know, since you did speak about trauma and partition, the person that I was telling you about, the person who's working on mental health policy of India, in fact, he is someone who has worked on trauma and the partition, you know, as a medical in that sense. So I mean, it might be something that will be interesting for you, but you know, so important what you've said. But like I said, that I mean, I feel that probably in our quarter, there's still, even though it's making headlines, and it should be making headlines here in India, but it does not make headlines in India somehow. But I think mental health, I mean, you know, though the term itself is problematic in some senses, but I think we're so far from accepting, you know, the neurodiversity, which should be outside the pathological understanding of neurodiversity, and this medicalization and over-medicalization, and then probably to connect it to more structural and systemic issues, which are really things that we have not even started to address in our discourses in some senses. But I think it's so important, and not just the political, but also the economic, you know, also the social, you know, also, you know, tradition and modernity. I mean, there's so many issues that are probably at hand which one needs to grapple with. And I think grapple is really the word, because I mean, you know, like you said, that not just bridging between the body and the mind, which you so are doing so wonderfully in your work, but there's so much, you know, that one needs to really look at here. And you know, that's why I really wanted you to come and speak to us, because I'm aware of this, you know, that that everybody around me in the university, old or young, is grappling with some issue or the other. I mean, just sharing an experience with you recently, and this would not have happened probably pre-pandemic. There was a student of mine in my class who was having an anxiety attack as the class was going on, and of course we all stopped. And immediately there was another student who could take out a petrol and offer to the student, as an immediate cure of relief, which could be given to her. And it makes you realize that I mean, you're sitting in a classroom where people are actually sitting on which is really like a time bomb, which is what people are, because of all the discourses which feed into this whole idea of neoliberal self-care, self-help, and whatever else, or pushes you to professional help or medical. And how much emotional labor as a teacher does one offer, when the epidemic is so huge, and so there's so much, and I'm so grateful to you. This was really one of the most important talks for me, because and I've been promising my students that we will talk about this. We've been talking about this in class, but this is so important, and I'm hoping that people who are here will take away from your work, go to your work and read, and probably make that work their own and speak about their own experiences, and make that like you said, that study itself is therapeutic in some senses. So I'm hoping that we will be able to, we can't give up hope, howsoever dismal the situation might be, but we will find ways of grappling with it. But so grateful to you, Anne, for this talk. But I'm not going to stand between you, and I'm sure there are lots and lots of questions which are there from the audiences. So I'm going to pass over to my colleague here, Susan, who will take on the questions and pose them to you. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Malhotra, and thank you so much, Professor Cvetkovic. This has been so wonderful and so important. And as Professor Malhotra did say, we do have quite some questions here. So if you allow, I will pose one after the other to you. Yes, perfect. So I'm going to read out the first question, which has been posed by Aditi Krishna, and we did receive a couple of questions which are similar or which touch upon the same kind of concerns that Aditi's questions raise, and therefore I'm going to pose Aditi's question here. The question reads, Professor Cvetkovic, thank you for your wonderful lecture. How do we protect care from capitalism? The perils of celebrating caring are many, as the world of capitalism has led us to believe that we must care for the environment by buying greener products, select those which may be recycled or that are socially and environmentally friendly, and lastly, not to forget the market around self-care. Only the expensive cream would take care of the cells in the skin. Only the overtly priced cotton will reduce our carbon footprint on the planet, which made by third world residents of Bangladesh and India. We can afford that care only because we're able to buy it as many times. If care can be bought and displayed, then the emotional labor that it requires may go amiss, which leads to the primary danger of care being subsumed by the market. Your comments, Professor Cvetkovic.
Yeah, exactly. This is why it's such a conundrum. And you very beautifully pointed out many, different specific issues that come up. Thank you also for bringing in this question of care of the environment in addition to care of the self, because care is often used in that context as well. And the thing is, I agree with all of that. And yet it seems to me that's a starting point, not a finishing point. That is exactly where I've grown dissatisfied with my own capacity for critique, and wanting to acknowledge this question of care and the market. In fact, that's also why I remain embedded in a Marxist tradition of cultural critique that understands affective life as entangled with capitalism. So it's always good to have that understanding. So for example, piece that I didn't have time to read from today was about my experience in a workshop with trans scholars working on the question of care. Hill Malatino's trans care book he was one of the leaders of that seminar, and I went back for the first time in a long time to Marxist feminist work on social reproduction, Engels and, property and the family and so on. I mean, I'm steeped in that work. And then there's a generation of feminists who've, wanted us to look carefully at emotional labor, affective labor, and so on. And all of that is great. But I'm just wanting to push, the grappling pushes me to the next step of yes, in the midst of all of that, what is a form of, call it care, maybe call it something else, of these networks that are different from the market. So that's what I'm trying to do in this work. And I don't know if I will be able to make it compelling, or if someone will still come along and be like, but it's all the market. I don't know.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is, I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly, but Chui Guin. And the question reads, although we can think of various kinds of reparative readings or grappling, sometimes these can lie within auto-theoretical frameworks, which, while making them more authentic, may make them difficult to recontextualize or generalize for wider political action. How can we think this through while acknowledging the importance of theorizing based on direct experience?
Wonderful. Yes. Again, you guys are really hitting, you understand the implications of what I'm saying. And in a sense, your questions are precisely the ones I'm wrestling with. So indeed, again, this work is very continuous with the work I've done previously in depression of public feeling, including my own engagement with a kind of auto-theoretical method, which does also come into play in this book as it's unfolding, both my own auto-theoretical work and then my analysis of other people's auto-theoretical work, let's say. And it's possible that audience is limited, for sure. And very context specific. That's why I was so interested to talk to you and to see, well, does Black feminism travel to India? I think actually it can and does. But it's important to not assume that and see what the points of contact might be. But yes, one of the things that's another frame for the book is writing as method. So I definitely am finding that I'm having to lay some ground. This is, again, maybe my training in English and literary studies. I've been teaching and writing about, what we loosely might call the hybrid forms of the essay, like the blending of fiction and nonfiction, the lyric essay of people like Claudia Rankine. I've been working on material by an Indigenous a writer, poet named Billy Ray Belcourt, who's doing amazing work in the genre of the lyric essay. Indeed, this is part of the agenda. I do think there are new writing genres that are coming into play, and I'm interested in the place of the essay as a way of doing particular kinds of public work. Again, I maybe have a kind of built-in investment here in the status of, if not the literary, certainly writing. I mean, again, this is where Arundhati Roy is interesting, because she's moved from the novel to the essay in order to have a certain kind of public voice. She's herself not necessarily auto-theoretical. She is kind of working in the more kind of classic essay genre, but I still find there is this interesting surge of different kinds of writing that I do want to pay attention to. It may not work for everyone, but I do think it warrants our scrutiny, and we as critics also can create conceptual space for that work to be understood better and not to be marginalized by what are often can be kind of misogynist dismissals of the personal. You know, we're still kind of end up with that as a point of tension.
Right. Thank you so much. The next question is from Grace. And Grace writes, thank you, Professor Cvetkovic. The idea of cultivating effective intervention as opposed to pharmaceutical intervention of curing the body is essential in today's capitalist world. So, indigenous methods of healing, especially from non-white societies, are becoming alternate methods of healing. However, even such approaches also slip into the already expanding world of cure and medicines. How then do we choose the methods of care? Also, how do you view religious affinities in developing care?
Also, in a sense, you're just naming like what I'm trying to work on, and I'm still in process. So in a sense, your question is my question. And I suppose to some extent, thus far, my approach is about specificity of example. So I'll just pull some other books. They're right here, so I can reach for them. One is, I'm definitely interested in the fusion of the trauma paradigm, which is quite medical, and racial justice. Let's see, I've been working with this book by Resma Menachem, My Grandmother's Hands. He's been very involved in Black Lives Matter politics in Minneapolis, even before the murder of George Floyd. And so I kind of look to people who are building these worlds together for these fusions and just, see how it works. To some extent, I'm also finding myself, I've been like, not interviewing people exactly, but seeking out conversations in order to see how these things play out on the ground. And in fact, I've been very interested too in indigenous approaches to medicine that work between a medical paradigm and a cultural one. And then two, the question of religion, I think, also is about what gets called religion and what gets called culture, right? So right now with work in indigenous epistemologies, which also are being renamed just indigenous ways of knowing, the delimiting of things as religion. And again, I'm treading with caution here because I'm mindful that there's a lot to be said here again in an Indian context that I can't speak for and to, but I've done some work on kind of affect in relation to religion, and I do think our paradigms also are in need of dramatic revision for and affect studies kind of has this on the agenda for this, let's see, another way of putting it is the secularism of kind of Western thought really has to be reconsidered. That's another item on the agenda that I think would help with some of this stuff. But I'm speaking in very broad strokes there. Again, I like when Professor Malhotra summarized my talk, I was just, kind of coming through your lens. I was like, oh my God, this is really a huge project, right? It's huge because it's implanted in thousands of geographically specific locations as well as national contexts, especially because we want to challenge the nation, right? And break it down into other microcultures. And it involves a kind of multidisciplinarity where we're challenging divisions between the secular and the sacred, between the medical and the humanities. And we know that that's a huge task. So I just kind of see myself like putting my little voice in and then trying to like create a conversation where you could put your voices in. And, this is what's amazing, that we get to have this conversation right now, because it's going to require a lot of bodies and a lot of minds to do the work.
Absolutely. I know we are overshooting time a little bit, but if you'd allow, we have many more questions. If I could pose a couple more questions, we'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll try to make really quick answers.
As you wish, as you wish. The next question is from Savita Singh. Professor Cvetkovic, I appreciated the point you made about the neoliberal democratic deficit regimes and the economy it sustains, which has increased mental health illnesses. Maybe this is also a kind of epidemic. Do you think that care can be conceptualized as political in response to your own concept of political depression? Then care becomes a radical concept. How do you construct this new radicality?
Well, I think I would just refer you to some great bibliography now that's grappling with this issue. So one, I'm not sure, I think it's in the text that I circulated to you. One is a special issue of the journal Social Text called Radical Care. Another is a special issue of SAQ, South Atlantic Quarterly, on CRIP temporalities, that has disability studies has been, I think, one of the most interesting places to see understandings of care transformed. And then again, I'm realizing, even hearing your question, that this is why I've been so gratified by this little book called Trans Care, which I think you can actually download digitally. It's available public access, open access, because it's very specific, right? Helma Latino is framing care as it emerges with trans people helping each other, find access to surgery, negotiate public spaces where microaggressions are a regular occurrence. And so I think there's a lot of room there for care to be defined in new and different ways, even as I also carry a certain critical framework, especially from queer theory and notions of the antisocial. I'm thinking of Lauren Berlant's posthumously published book on the inconvenience of others, which does the affect studies work of saying, you know what, let's not romanticize, like, relations between people are often really fraught, really difficult. And, it's not just like, oh, I care and suddenly everything's okay. So I really, that's why I like to also bring it down to the micro level in order to understand the nuance of the category care.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is from Parul Batra, and she says, Professor, I would love to hear your thoughts on grappling with mental health and care within the domestic sphere.
I'm wondering what you might be thinking about there, but what springs to mind is just this has also been part of this work I've done with queer and trans scholars, is the reminder that the domestic is not always a friendly place. So this has been one of the kind of gender essentialisms that has to be exploded is the presumption that, the maternal is automatically a source of care, the domestic is automatically a source of care. Also because, yes, the state is only too happy to farm out care to individual people or to families. So again, your question is an important one, because I think we have to, again, keep a critical eye on the relation between care and the domestic.
Thank you, Professor. And I'll pose the last two questions. They are in some ways related to each other, so I'll just connect them together and pose. The first question is, Professor Cvetkovic, you spoke about mental health and institutional accommodations and provisions, which are increasingly being made for people suffering from mental health issues. However, the invisibility of symptoms in the case of mental health issues many a times, which is quite different from what one would expect from physical illnesses, becomes a serious limitation to this. How do we address this? That is the question. Should I read the next question as well?
Yeah. Put them together.
Right. The next question is from Ishita, and the question says, physical health, mental health, and care are so closely related that it sometimes results in a vicious cycle of worsening someone's condition. For example, with ample limitations still existing in medical sciences, many doctors tend to dismiss the patient's physical pain or evident symptoms as psychological to defend their own incompetence at diagnosis. This constant denial of excruciating physical pain that the patient might be grappling with can result in mental health issues like depression, even if the person hasn't already been suffering with it. The constant negation of pain is a kind of traumatic experience for the patient. Shouldn't there be a strict measure to ensure that doctors who aren't experts in mental health must not diagnose patients with mental health issues and rather stick to their own areas of expertise? Thank you.
Interesting. Yeah. These are good. And again, sites of grappling for me as well. This is particularly where this notion of body-mind comes in, but I don't want to use it too quickly to resolve the dualisms that these questions note are still quite prevalent, right? And in fact, I myself have been guilty in some ways, I think sometimes, because of my anti-medical bias. I've sometimes had an anti-somatic bias, right? Where I'm like, mental health is not in like neurotransmitters and biochemical disorder. It's in the world out there. But I think particularly found very useful work on kind of post-human notions of the interconnection, right, of bodies, atmospheres. I think one book I love here is Mel Chen's Animacies on the question of the toxic, and actually Chen has a new book coming out called Intoxication, and it's really it really kind of, and Donna Haraway is important here. I just like, you start picturing, these particles, right? Or like bodies and environments as kind of fusing into one another. This is where breath is also really important, because it's this way in which the internal and the external are intimately connected and intertwined at all times. So I just have found it really fascinating to keep thinking with those issues. And then it makes this question of medical expertise really complicated too. This back and forth between the physical and the mental. So for example, in the US, one reason why pharmaceuticals can be so widely prescribed is actually you don't need to go to an expert psychiatrist. You can just go to your family doctor. And there's some things that are actually good about that in terms of accessibility, but also difficult. And this has also been why I've been so interested in the accommodation process in the university, is when you are dealing with potentially invisible disabilities, what are the mechanisms for that? I'm kind of favor the possibility for self-declaration. I also think this would be I was thinking about this also in a Indian context, right? Where I'm familiar with like examination structures and really competitive hierarchies, both within India and also for getting out of India and having access to education elsewhere. That one of the things that, you know, the academy produces stress, right? Because the competition, particularly right now where like the job market is terrible, for PhDs. The job market is terrible for young people. And again, India has been dealing with those, I feel like has had this it's still like a legacy of colonialism, is this holdover of this, this form of competition for resource. By being that all of that is just a recipe for mental health meltdown. And so again, you know, our school structures are producing these mental health issues, and then we're trying to like band-aid it by creating these other infrastructures. It's kind of a mess, and I just want to keep backing up and being like, how can we do this differently? You know, not just through reformism, but through really having to think about education in different ways. Hope that resonates in some way. I mean, I wish, you know, that I were going out to lunch with you or dinner or late night drinks or something, so that I could like glean more of I'm just making guesses, right, as to what's going on in your context. And so it would be so interesting to be able to have that conversation.
Really hope we can have you over,
Yeah.
and sometime. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Susan, for buttoning. Please,
No, I was just going to say that, and also going to request Professor Malhotra to please, get us on with that. And we'd be so excited as scholars to be able to do that. And we really look forward to it. Thank you so much, Professor Cvetkovic. We're very grateful for your time, and you've been so patient with us. You've really been indulging all our questions. And we have many more in our chat box, but I'm afraid we'll really, test your patience. And therefore, we move ahead, and I invite my colleague Kaparna to deliver the official vote of thanks. Thank you again.
Good evening, everyone. It has been an intellectual treat to listen to Professor Anne Cvetkovic speak. And on behalf of the Department of English and the organizing team, I would like to thank everyone who made today's event successful. First and foremost, a huge thank you to our speaker, Professor Cvetkovic, who has given us so much to think about. Her talk was truly enriching, and we thank her for sharing her scholarship with us. Thank you, Professor Cvetkovic, for lending us so much of your time and for sharing your insights with us. We are indeed grateful to you. As always, I would also like to thank our HOD, Professor Simi Malhotra. Thank you to Suman, Susan, Zara, and everyone on the organizing team who are responsible for running our event so smoothly. And thank you to our audience, everyone who tuned in today from all sorts of time zones and places. Thank you so much, friends, and we hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anne, and have a wonderful day ahead. So grateful for this conversation. Yes, and I hope we can have you over in India sometime soon.
You know, it's the one place that is the top of my list to go. And it's become so hard to get there. So I hope we can make that happen. Seriously. I just was putting a note saying, the questions must have gone into a different chat box or something, right?
Yes.
So are you able to, I'm saving this chat because there's some good stuff in there, but can you send me the questions? Are you able to do that? Because those were great questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Sure.
You
Thanks so
really
much.
got it. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Thanks,
bye.
Anne. Yeah, thank you so much. So grateful. Bye-bye.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah. So I think before you close the session, it might be a good idea if we need to save the questions for her, then we'll need to do that.
Yes. I've just made a copy and I will edit it and send it across.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to sign off. Bye.
Bye-bye.